This is part four of the of the chapter 45 lecture notes. In part three, I just felt bad because I was kind of unprepared talking about the map of the world. So I just wanted to point out some things. I was right that this is Greenland. So just in case there are any of you who are like me and not that great with geography, um, so we have basically Asia is around here in the Middle East, and then Europe in this area, Australia here, and Africa, and then, um, of course, Central and South America, and then North America. So where we're seeing um, like a decline in population is in Greenland and Russia, and that makes sense. I mean, you don't think about those you probably would have guessed those populations don't grow very fast. Very small amount of growth in Australia and China, and I was thinking about China because they had that rule for a while, which they have done away with, but they had the rule where a couple can only have one child. That they are no longer doing that, but I'm sure that has caused them not to have a really high growth rate. Because they're already overcrowded. And then the areas where we're seeing the greatest growth are going to be in the countries that are economically, more disadvantaged. So these areas here, Africa and Central and South America, um, over into some parts of Asia and the Middle East. So those are economically less economically developed. Okay, so let's move back to where we were. I can remember here. Okay, so these are just invasive species that come in and take over an area because they have no competition since they originated somewhere else. These mussels, as you can see, um, the this one is the buckthorn. This is a mustard, garlic mustard plant. The emerald ash borer infects ash trees and can wipe out those ash tree populations. And then this is a bird, a starling that can outcompete native bird species. So, and another invasive species that's really common around here is kudzu. Okay, so community dynamics. That is the next topic. Um, This is showing secondary succession. So let me tell you what primary succession is. Primary succession would happen, for example, if a volcano erupts and then covers the ground or forms an island. That's a better, forms a island that's nothing but rock because it's just hardened lava. That would be primary succession because you would have absolutely no plant growth, no soil formation. The community is growing literally from the beginning, from the very start. There's nothing to start with, so it would be bare rock basically. All the species of that community would be there would be none, and then it would grow from there. In secondary succession, you have that's going to occur, for example, after a forest fire. So you're still going to have some roots that of plants that remained that weren't hurt by the fire, and you're going to have some growth. So what you have with secondary succession is you'll start out with a pioneer species, which is pretty much grasses and annual plants, which are plants that live for a year, and then like if you had an annual plant, if you had an annual plant in your garden, you would have to replant it every year. And perennials are ones that live from year to year to year. So grasses and perennials will succeed or take over the annual plants. And then the next phase would be intermediate species, which will be a little taller, shrubs, pines, and then the um, I can't, the deciduous trees like oak trees and hickory trees. And then in your climax community, you're going to have mature oak and hickory forest with some pine trees um, scattered in there. Um, Succession describes the sequential appearance and disappearance of a species in a community over time. In primary succession, newly exposed or newly formed land is colonized by living things. So again, for example, after a volcanic eruption. In secondary succession, which would be like after a flood or after a fire, um, part of the ecosystem is disturbed and remnants of the previous community remain. Now, the next part, I think this is the last part, is on behavior. So, innate behaviors means that these are behaviors you're born with, these are genetic behaviors. Reflexes are innate behaviors. We have several reflexes. Humans have several reflexes. We know the knee-jerk reflex. There's one that's real common that you check for in children, the Babinski reflex, where you rub the underside of the foot. Um, and it's a reflex, for example, when you step on something that hurts your foot, it's a reflex to lift your foot up, or if you touch something hot, to pull your hand away. Kinesis is undirected movement in response to a stimulus. So it's just response to any stimulus, whether it be food or light. Taxis is movement towards or away from that stimulus. So positive taxis would be movement toward the stimulus. Um, Positive phototaxis, for example, is movement toward light. Negative phototaxis would be movement away from light. Um, Kinesis is just movement. Like whenever something, whenever you're scared, you move, or whenever you, um, it's just a stimulus happens and it causes an organism to move in some way, but it's not toward or away. It's just movement in general. A fixed action pattern. These are really, really interesting in birds. These are a series of movements, and bees as well. A series of movements elicited by a stimulus, such that even when the stimulus is removed, the pattern goes on to completion. So, one fixed action pattern is with the emperor penguins. It's so cold where they live that um, they uh, the female has to give the egg to the male at a certain point, and because they have to sit on the egg continuously, because if that egg is exposed to the air for even just a few seconds, um, it's going to freeze and the baby will die. The embryo will die. So the fixed action pattern is the way that these penguins use their beaks and their bodies and sort of move that egg from one to the other without it being exposed to the atmosphere. And they may do that fixed action pattern even if the egg was removed, I guess. But another fixed action pattern, other ones are like courtship behavior. Certain birds have a courtship dance or song. Those are fixed action patterns. Um, Migration is just long range seasonal movement. Obligate are animals that always migrate, and facultative are animals that can choose to migrate or not. And incomplete means some of the population migrates while others do not. Some other innate behaviors, courtship displays, which can be also fixed action patterns, aggressive displays, living in groups. Um, so innate just means that you're born with that behavior. This is an example of a fixed action pattern. Male three-spined stickleback fish exhibit a fixed action pattern. During the mating season, the males develop a bright red belly and they react strongly to red-bottomed objects that in no way resemble fish. So in other words, they have a fixed action pattern to where they're going to be aggressive with other males. So they're because they're competing for who's going to fertilize the egg, and so they're aggressive with anything with a red bottom. um, Migration. Here we see migration of wildebeest. Foraging is just hunting for food. Courtship displays. These are storks, and courtship displays can be fixed action patterns as well. Imprinting is of course, you probably heard about this, but it's just when like a duckling is born, the minute it's born, whoever it sees first, it thinks is its mother. The attachment of all these ducklings to their mother is imprinting. And classical conditioning, so these are not innate behaviors. Classical conditioning, for example, is training a dog to expect food and when it hears a bell. This is Pavlov's experiment. You may have studied in psychology. Um, so the dog is going to salivate and expect food even if there's no food. The dog is salivating in response to the bell because it's been conditioned to expect food with the bell. Operant conditioning is training and an animal to do something by giving it a reward, so reinforcing their behavior. So when they do something that you want them to do, you give them food or something like that. A lot of animals are trained that way. We train our children that way too. Cognitive learning is the higher level or the highest level of learning. Um, all right, so group one is rewarded with food at the completion of their run through this maze. This is a T maze. And I am trying to see on here rats. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't know what organisms were running through the maze. So rats are running through the maze. Group one is rewarded with food at the completion of the run. Group two is not rewarded the first 6 days, but rewarded with food after day 6. So their number of errors is um, is decreasing with time. Okay, but then if you look at group three, they're not rewarded the first 3 days, but rewarded after day 3. They have I guess, the worst results. The rats that are given food earlier learned faster. So it just shows that their cognitive means that they're having to figure out. So they're having to think. They're having to figure out which way do I go, And so each time they get to a point in the maze when they get to a T junction, they have to decide whether to go right or left. So it's cognitive because it's a higher level of learning. It's not just, you know, training a dog to sit is not really cognitive that much. I mean, it's just it's more simple learning. And I believe this is the last. Yes. Okay. This is the last one.